The runway was white with hoarfrost and the sound of heater carts, a long metal tongue of pierced steel planking that hummed like a tuning fork before dawn. Ground crews moved by sequence, not by shouting. Hand to chalk, glance to watch, two fingers to the crew chief, a nod back. Inside the briefing hut, the board did not list aces or tallies, it listed minutes. Wheels up 0714, tankers 0740, bombers at the initial point 0802. Captain Lewis Ward tapped each column with a piece of chalk. If one link is late, nothing dramatic explodes. The machine just stops working. Don't let it. Outside, the Mustangs rolled in pairs. Props bit the mist and turned the field into a bowl of muffled thunder. There was no ceremony on the radio, only short, exact syllables on a clean VHF net. Speech trimmed to carry decisions instead of stories. Two ships lifted and tucked their gear in the same heartbeat, slid right into a sun-offset line, and began the slow drift that looked like laziness to anyone who had never learned what fuel could buy when spent on geometry. Far to the east, a river drew a dull seam under low weather. Beyond it, German controllers watched green ghosts coalesce and drift across scopes. They still counted airplanes. How many fighters, how many angles, how many chances. The Americans counted density of coverage, fuel, and moments. Any line to the bombers would pass through places already occupied, by altitude, by timing, by a pilot whose only job was to be there when that line arrived. Ward's flight settled into the first screen not because enemy aircraft were present, but because the schedule said air at that bearing must be guarded. High and a little right of the sun, they held a rectangle of sky like roof tiles, overlaps measured in minutes and degrees. Below and west, another layer drifted the opposite way. The grid did not look like a trap. Traps seldom do from the outside. On the German side, Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt pulled on his gloves and felt the old joy of cold air under a canopy. Clear day. Good air. The kind of morning instructors promised when they still described war as a place to prove yourself. The controller's voice drew a neat triangle in his head. Base, climb, cut. It all made sense until the sun turned canopies into white glass and a shape appeared that did not appear, and then three more did the same. Reinhardt banked for a duel and found procedure. The first Mustang did not chase, it turned him. The second did not press, it waited where his turn would end. By the time he chose to dive, the altimeter had already chosen for him, and a thunderbolt below had been told to expect a falling man in roughly 1 minute. At 8:02, the bomber stream reached its gate as if the sky had opened a door on hinges of contrails. Ward checked fuel, heard his tanker exactly where it should be, and felt the particular quiet that meant the next 10 minutes were already occupied. The Luftwaffe would not lose today to a braver roll or a tighter turn. It would lose to a mesh of times and altitudes and short words, to a watch that nobody let slip. Invisible lattice. The German control room sounded like a library before opening. On the scope, green ghosts woke slowly, rolled across the grid, and fell back into noise. The duty officer checked his watch, 8 minutes until the bomber stream crossed the line. Weather was the kind you wished on trainees. High ceiling, clean air, the sun behind you. The plan was schoolbook simple. Climb to the angle, hit once, break the box, go home. If they got there before the screen thickened, there was a chance. West of the river, the Allied forward field felt different, like a well-tuned workshop. Frequency boards on hooks, a chalked schedule on the briefing wall. Wheels up 0714, tankers 0740, stream at the gate 0802, codes by the card. No stories on the air, only decisions. A dry joke about polite seconds, and the brief was over. Men walked out not to seek a fight, but to take a shift inside a large machine where each minute already had an owner. The first escort layer rose like a sustained organ note. Pairs lifted and drifted to the sun, high and a little right, holding a lazy-looking slide that wasn't laziness at all. Drift bought geometry. It conserved fuel, kept angles neat, and held the screen intact longer than any showy weave. A second layer took the counterslide, lower into the west. Each tile overlapped a vector any interceptor would have to fly to reach the bombers, even if he remembered every trick taught at school. Tricks wouldn't matter here. Being in the right place on the right minute would. Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt drew a finger across the frost at his canopy edge. The sun flared. He loved days like this. Dense air, a willing wing, a motor that sang. The controller sang too. Takeoff, climb, turn, cut. Hit before their cover tightens. It all fit until somewhere in the climb band where the sun turned glass to milk, something moved without moving. The screen did not dive into a dogfight. It did what it existed to do. Tilt space slightly. Reinhardt took his correct line and found out the line now ran through air already spoken for. The first Mustang didn't duel him. It denied him the last degree. The second didn't press, it waited where that denial would end. It wasn't combat, it was a turnstile. Below, between layers, thunderbolts played the low accompaniment, watching flanks and floor. Their job sounded simple and felt brutal. Make sure anyone who fell through from above arrived without momentum. Engines grumbled with surplus, but nobody flexed. The strength here lived on a watch, not a throttle. On the American net, syllables were rationed. Tally 3, 11 high. Drag east, 2 mics. These weren't requests, they were decisions in transit. 2 mics meant that in roughly 120 seconds a target would exist in a particular place, whether or not you could see it. When Reinhardt, cut short at the angle, chose to dump, then climb later, the Thunderbolt told to expect a falling silhouette in 1 minute, saw it in 58 seconds. That was enough. Fuel wasn't a number on a dial, it was somebody else's logistics. The escort flowed to the tanker track without making holes. 2 ships headed out to drink, while 2 thickened the screen. The sky didn't change to the naked eye, a possibility vanished instead. Reinhardt's third climb felt like pouring minutes through the injectors. His wingman called bingo. The next decision belonged to the needle, not the pilot. At 8:02, the bomber stream reached the gate as if the sky had opened a door on contrail hinges. The escort did not clutch the bombers like shepherd dogs from a painting. It kept angles. A high dome covered the stream's head. A net guarded the tail, exactly where finishers like to live. Cross screens pulled diagonally across the flanks, shredding approaches that looked safe on charts and died in practice. The German controller said forward at a moment that still made sense on paper. In the air, the first head-on dissolved after a gentle push from above. No swirling fight, just a stolen angle and a spent entrance. The second attempt from astern died in an instant as the diagonal pair appeared before the sight picture could settle. Nobody argued for a third try. Fuel had withdrawn the vote. The ground reached up to help. Allied flak worked not as a rug but as a room. Proximity fuses turned a sector into geometry. Bursts appeared not because someone lit them, but because a fighter entered a pre-calculated box of space. One short air-to-ground correction and the corridor that looked clear a heartbeat earlier didn't exist. Abort, the German controller said, and the word was repeated by the tanks more faithfully than by the pilots. Landing was quieter than takeoff. Reinhardt rolled out and, without shutting down, watched his mine at hand. He hadn't lost to a better airplane. The Mustang hadn't done magic. He had lost to a schedule. Someone had occupied his minutes and never gave one back. A crewman flashed a cheerful thumbs up into the cockpit. It was kinder than reality deserved. Nothing about this was fine. On the American side, the whiteboard looked as ordinary as it had at dawn. 0758, top screen delayed entry. 0804, cross screen, tail shut. 0812, tanker cycle with no gap. Not a line about who outturned whom. The day's formula was simple. Protect the flow, close the windows, keep the tempo, fix the intervals here and here. Victories were counted differently. A victory was any interval the enemy failed to enter. On the map, only pencils snapped. A controller tied tomorrow to today with a short length of wire. Same 0714, same 0802, same racetrack circles where the tankers already felt at home. No promises, no swagger. The quiet confidence of a machine that will catch on the first push. And yet one thing had shifted for good. The understanding on the other side. In Reinhardt's grease-smudged notebook between flight time and fuel figures, a sentence appeared without adjectives. Late by a minute. He meant the attack. What he'd really missed was the era. Once the sky became a system, courage stopped being a currency you could spend to make up a deficit. This is how a battle ends without spectacle, by closing the gap between minutes until there's no place left for chance to live. When one side learned to hold time, the air ceased to belong to the best at the turn. It belonged to the best at the schedule. While one side hunted for an opportunity, the other had already occupied the time. The landing rollout was longer than necessary. Reinhardt held the glide shallow and wide, stretching it as if those extra meters could rewind the hour he'd just lived. The engines shuddered to stillness at strip's end, and the canopy cracked open to cold air that hit his face like a reminder. Below the wing, ground crews were already moving, not in haste, but in the practiced rhythm of aircraft that had come back empty. A mechanic glanced at the pylons and said nothing. That silence was a kind of speech. The debrief room was still warm from the morning briefing when they walked in. Reinhardt and 2 wingmen, their suits still damp from altitude. The operations officer stood before a map marked with red lines for their route and blue for the screen they'd tried to penetrate. Twice. When did you see the first layer? The captain asked, not looking up. How long until the second attempt? Reinhardt noticed. No one asked how many. The questions traced moments, not tallies, where gaps had opened, why none had held long enough. Across the Rhine, on the American side, a very different quiet. The briefing board listed the day's success in intervals. Top screen 0758 to 0808. Tail coverage maintained. Tanker cycle, no breaks. Pilots reported their fuel times, not their adrenaline. An intelligence officer circled points on a map where intercepts could have happened, but hadn't. If they'd come through here, he said, tapping the board, we'd have had a problem. No one asked how close it had been. They were already planning tomorrow's tighter schedule. Back at the German field, Reinhardt sat alone on a bench outside the operations tent, hands still trembling slightly from the cold at altitude. His flight suit was soaked in places, the gloves at the wrists, the collar. He pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind pilots kept for calculations and private thoughts, and turned to a page already crowded with fuel figures and time marks. In the margin, in handwriting that looked older than it should have, he wrote, Spät eine Minute, aber nicht die Attacke, alles. Late by a minute, but not the attack. Everything. He closed the notebook and looked at his hands. They'd stopped shaking. In the distance, ground crews were already refueling the next batch of aircraft for an afternoon sweep. The schedule would repeat. The windows would remain closed. And somewhere in an American headquarters, someone was drawing lines on a map, marking minutes, preparing for tomorrow's intervals to be slightly tighter than today's. Reinhardt checked his watch. 16:47. He had enough time to eat before the briefing for the second mission, the one that would follow the same script with the same ending. He understood it now. They weren't losing battles anymore. They were losing time itself. The afternoon briefing was the same as the morning, with one difference. Everyone knew how it would end. Same times, same altitudes, same impossible math. Reinhardt sat through the lecture on defensive tactics, feints, scissor maneuvers, the old tricks, and felt the words empty themselves of meaning. A commander from headquarters droned on about individual excellence and pilot initiative. The men listened with the politeness of people attending their own funeral. After the briefing, outside the operations tent, a senior pilot, an ace with 42 confirmed kills marked on his fuselage in small white crosses, stood smoking and staring at the runways. His name was Dieter, and 3 years ago he would have been a god in this squadron. Now he was just someone waiting for his fuel to be checked. Reinhardt approached him. 42, Reinhardt said, meaning the crosses. Dieter didn't turn. 38 now. 4 today, the Americans claim differently. He tapped Ash. You flew this morning? Twice. And? Nothing. No angles. No moments. Dieter nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd been thinking. You know what the difference is between now and 1941? He didn't wait for an answer. Then a good pilot could win. An excellent pilot could win harder. Now? He finally turned to look at Reinhardt. The best pilot in the Luftwaffe can't defeat a schedule, can't outthink a radio frequency, can't climb faster than a fuel calculation. He pointed at his fuselage, at the white crosses that meant nothing anymore. Those were when the sky was still a place to win. Now it's a place to lose on time. I'm not an ace because I'm better than them. I was an ace because they didn't have a system yet. Now they do, and every plane that flies under their rules is just moving pieces on a board someone else owns. Reinhardt understood. The myth of the ace, the idea that courage, skill, and nerve could overcome numbers, had died not in combat, but in American planning rooms. No fighter pilot had killed it. An engineer with a frequency allocator had. That night, before the evening sweep, Reinhardt sat in the ready room and watched the other pilots. The young ones still carried the old faith. They still talked about getting a turn, about surprising them at altitude, about moments of brilliance that would change everything. The old ones said nothing. They cleaned their guns and checked their watches. The truth was harder than any loss. In a war of systems, the individual pilot had become a diagnostic tool, useful for verifying that the system was working, but powerless to break it. You could be the finest flyer in 3 nations and still come home empty, not because you weren't good enough, but because good enough no longer mattered. What mattered was being in the right place at the right second, and the Americans had booked every second for weeks in advance. Reinhardt's commanding officer passed the ready room and paused. He was a fair man, a realist. He'd been a pilot once before he became something that pilots no longer had time to be, a thinker. Reinhardt, he said quietly. Tomorrow they're changing the schedule again. Later takeoff, lower cruising altitude to save fuel. The window gets smaller each day, but we keep flying into it anyway. He paused. Do you understand what that means? Reinhardt understood. It meant the Americans had learned from yesterday's intervals. They were tightening the margin even more, because margins were the only currency left. Minutes compressed into seconds, seconds into fractions. Yes, sir, Reinhardt said. Good. Then you know why none of this matters anymore. The officer left, and the room fell silent again. Outside, the sun was setting over the Rhine, painting the water gold and red. In 3 hours, aircraft would launch into that light, and the schedule would execute, and the sky would remain empty of German success. Not because the pilots weren't brave, but because bravery had stopped being relevant. The age of the ace had ended not with a bang, but with a timetable. The evening sweep launched at 18:14, 2 minutes behind schedule because a fuel truck delayed one of the aircraft. 2 minutes. It was enough to shift the geometry of the entire mission. Reinhardt felt it as he climbed. The schedule was fragmenting, not because of German skill or courage, but because logistics had a margin of error of precisely 120 seconds. The bomber stream was 3 minutes late crossing the Rhine. That meant the top cover would be transitioning between fuel and fresh waves. Theoretically, a gap existed. Reinhardt saw it on the scope. A 30-second window, maybe 45, where the density of escort would thin by 1 or 2 aircraft as refueled fighters rotated back into position. It was the smallest opportunity of the entire month. He'd trained his whole career to exploit gaps like this. but by the time he reached the intercept point, the gap had closed. Not because someone had anticipated him, but because the American schedule had built in a 1 minute buffer for delays. The thing ran like a clock that included its own errors in the calculation. They'd thought ahead to his thinking ahead. 3 layers deep, past human intention, and into pure mathematics. He tried anyway. It was a good approach, high sun angle, careful energy management, the kind of setup that would have worked in 1943. He got to within half a mile of the bomber box before the escort reacted. Not with urgency or aggression, but with the calm efficiency of something that had already accounted for his presence. A Mustang descended from above and ahead, placing itself between Reinhardt and his target with the precision of a gate closing. No duel, no opportunity to fight back. Just geometric inevitability. Reinhardt broke hard, pulled back on the stick, and felt his aircraft respond the way it always did. Willing, fast, alive. For a moment the old feeling came back. He was still a hunter, and the sky was still a place where skill mattered. He got his nose up, got lead on the American fighter, felt the control surfaces bite as he began a climbing turn that had won him 3 victories years ago. The Mustang didn't follow. It didn't need to. It simply continued its programmed descent, trusting the escort behind it. And when Reinhardt's climb peaked, right where his energy and altitude reached perfect balance, 2 more Mustangs were already there, having arrived at that exact spot at that exact moment because someone in a briefing tent had calculated that's where a German pilot would try to go if he got this far. Reinhardt rolled, dove, hit the throttle. His fuel gauge told him he had 17 minutes of flight time remaining. That gave him exactly 15 minutes to find a gap that didn't exist and get home. The math was simple and absolute. There was no option after that. No extended search, no waiting for a better moment. At 15 minutes, he turned back or he walked. He made it back with 12 minutes of reserve, landing hard on a dirt strip closer to friendly territory than his home field. The aircraft was fine. The pilot was not. That night, in a room with other pilots, Reinhardt learned that 2 other sorties had flown that same evening. Both had turned back early. All 4 aircraft had returned to base with fuel to spare, having found nothing. The Americans' buffer had held. Their schedule had absorbed every attempt, every last-moment shift, every careful gamble. The system worked because it had been built to work despite people trying to break it. A younger pilot, barely more than 20, said quietly, "Tomorrow they'll tighten the schedule again, won't they?" No one answered because the answer was obvious. Yes, and the day after that they would tighten it again. Until every minute held an escort, every altitude had a layer, every vector was accounted for. The Americans had discovered something the Luftwaffe was only now understanding. Victory wasn't won by defeating enemy pilots. It was won by making it impossible for enemy pilots to exist in useful places at useful times. The age of improvisation was over. The age of calculation had won. Reinhardt sat outside and watched the stars come out. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of aircraft engines being serviced, ground crews preparing for tomorrow's impossible sorties. In the morning he would fly again. He would find no gap, he would come home on time, and the schedule would continue, day after day, until the only gap left was the one between understanding the enemy had a system and accepting that no individual courage could beat it. The last window had closed. Everyone just kept flying toward the locked door anyway. 2 weeks later, the margins had compressed further. The American schedule now ran on intervals of 90 seconds instead of the original 120. That meant more aircraft cycling through the tanker track, more fuel buffers, more layers of coverage. The Luftwaffe tried harder. They flew more sorties, burned more fuel, sent pilots with reckless energy into impossible geometry. None of it mattered. The system absorbed effort like a mathematical function accepts input. It simply produced the same output. No breakthroughs. Reinhardt noticed something strange during the 3rd week. The bombing raids were becoming longer. Longer transit times. The American bombers were lingering over target areas, staying in formation, resisting the chaff and flak with a kind of stubborn patience that only made sense if they knew they were protected. And they were protected, so completely, so systematically, that the Luftwaffe had become little more than a reference point on the American debrief boards. German opposition light. Enemy fighter activity, 0 kills. Escort schedule held to plan. The phrase escort schedule held to plan appeared in intelligence summaries now. It meant the same thing every time. The Americans had calculated how many fighters would attack, when they would attack, and from what altitude, and they had been right. The system worked because it assumed failure and built-in redundancy. When Reinhardt and his squadron did appear, they simply triggered a pre-positioned response. It was like fighting a machine that had your move programmed into it before you even thought of making it. One afternoon, a staff officer from headquarters flew down to the field to conduct interviews. He was young, probably late 20s, with the kind of eyes that had seen too many briefings and not enough combat. He asked Reinhardt to walk him around the field to explain the situation. Reinhardt showed him the aircraft, the maintenance logs, the fuel allocations. The officer asked about tactics, about aggression, about commitment. Commitment? Reinhardt repeated quietly. Sir, commitment won in 1941. Tactics won in 1943. What's happening now isn't about either. It's about whether you can occupy a point in space at a moment in time when the enemy has already decided you won't. We can't. They have. The officer looked confused, or perhaps offended. It was hard to tell. Then what do you recommend? Recommendation? Reinhardt thought about it. Stop flying. It's less exhausting, and the outcome is identical. The officer didn't appreciate that. He left later that day, presumably to file a report about pilot morale. But Reinhardt meant what he'd said. There was a mathematics to this that couldn't be fought. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft. The Luftwaffe still had pilots. But they no longer had time. The Americans had bought it all up, every viable moment between sunrise and sunset, and turned it into a contract written in coordinates and frequencies. That evening, before the final sweep of the day, Reinhardt sat with his squadron and calculated their survival odds. 3 aircraft were being sent north as bait. Their job was to draw the escort down so the main body could strike at the bombers. It was the oldest trap in air combat, and it hadn't worked in 3 months. But they kept trying anyway because command demanded it. Reinhardt raised his hand. Request to sit this one out, sir. The commander looked at him for a long moment. On what grounds? On the grounds that I understand the outcome in advance and prefer not to verify it personally again? To Reinhardt's surprise, the commander nodded. Just once. No lecture, no disciplinary threat. Just a nod that meant, I know. We all know. But we keep going because stopping means admitting the war is over, and nobody's authorized to do that yet. 2 of the 3 aircraft assigned to the bait flight didn't come back. 1 pilot bailed out near friendly territory. The other, a young officer named Kraft, simply didn't appear in the post-mission accounting. The main attack had been intercepted before it even formed up. 8 bombers were damaged. 0 American fighters were downed. In the evening debrief, the commander read the summary from headquarters. Luftwaffe committed inadequate forces at suboptimal timing. Recommend increased pilot training and aggressive tactics. Reinhardt watched the other pilots' faces as that was read. Some looked angry. Some looked sad. Most looked like men observing the last rites of something that had already died. They knew the same way Reinhardt knew that the Luftwaffe wasn't failing because of inadequate tactics or insufficient commitment. It was failing because it was fighting an enemy that had industrialized victory. The Americans hadn't just built better aircraft or trained better pilots. They had built a system that made individual brilliance irrelevant. They had made the sky into a schedule, and schedules could not be defeated in air combat. Schedules could only be outlasted, and Germany no longer had the fuel, literal or metaphorical, to wait longer than the Americans. Outside the operations tent, Reinhardt found Dieter standing alone, watching the sun set over the Rhine. The ace looked smaller somehow, as if the knowledge of his own obsolescence had physically diminished him. Kraft didn't come back, Reinhardt said quietly. Dieter nodded. He'd already heard. The system processes him anyway. Fills out the paperwork. Assigns his aircraft to someone else. Continues the schedule. They stood in silence. Somewhere in the distance, maintenance crews were refueling for the next day. Somewhere across the Rhine, American supply trucks were bringing fresh ammunition and fuel to air bases where the system never stopped calculating. How long? Reinhardt asked. Dieter didn't look at him. Until they run out of targets. Until we run out of pilots. Probably the same day. The sun touched the river and turned it the color of blood. In the morning, there would be another briefing. Another impossible schedule. Another attempt to find a gap that mathematics had already closed. The war wasn't being decided by courage or cowardice anymore. It was being decided by someone in an American headquarters running their pencil down a calculation and saying, that's when we'll own the sky. Not from 08 Zollert to 0815. From 08 Zollert to 20 Joy. Every day, until they give up. The Luftwaffe hadn't given up yet, but Reinhardt could feel it, a kind of acceptance settling over the pilots like cold fog. They would keep flying. But they would fly knowing with mathematical certainty that they had already lost. Reinhardt didn't attend the next briefing. Instead, he walked to the edge of the airfield where the old aircraft were kept. The ones too damaged or outdated to fly in current operations. He sat on the wing of a Bf-109E, one from the older generation, its paint faded by 3 years of European weather. This particular plane had been flown by someone named Kessler, according to the faint markings still visible on the fuselage. Kessler had 13 confirmed kills painted in neat white crosses. 13 was enough to matter once upon a time. The mechanics had left him alone. They understood somehow that this wasn't a technical problem they could fix. He pulled out the leather notebook and opened it to a clean page. Then he sat for an hour without writing anything. The pen was ready. The words weren't. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because saying it would make it real in a way that thinking it wasn't. A young mechanic, the same one who had looked at Reinhardt's empty pylons weeks ago, eventually approached and sat on the wing nearby. He didn't say anything. Reinhardt appreciated that. After a while, the mechanic spoke quietly. I heard you refused the next sortie. I requested to sit it out. Reinhardt corrected. Functionally the same thing, isn't it? Reinhardt didn't answer. The mechanic seemed to take that as confirmation. My brother flew fighters, you know. Earlier in the war, 1942. He told me the sky was beautiful then. Dangerous, but beautiful. Said you could be clever in it. Find angles, surprise people. The mechanic looked at his hands. He died at Dieppe when his engine quit. Not shot down. Just mechanical failure in the middle of a dive. Whole thing was 3 seconds, he told me before he went back up. 3 seconds from perfect angle to dead. The mechanic paused. At least that was his war. At least then, when he died, it was his war. Not some schedule's war. Reinhardt opened the notebook and wrote, I will not fly again. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a letter of protest or a manifesto against the system. It was just 4 words, small and neat in the margin of a page already crowded with calculations of moments and fuel and altitude. Once written, he closed the notebook and handed it to the mechanic. Give this to the commander, Reinhardt said. Tell him I'm requesting ground duties, supply coordination, navigation planning, anything that doesn't involve sitting in a cockpit and verifying that mathematics works. The mechanic took it carefully. What will they say? They'll call it dereliction. They might shoot me for it, or they might just transfer me to some administrative hole where I can't hurt the schedule. Reinhardt looked at the old aircraft around him. But I won't spend another hour in a machine, waiting for geometry to prove I'm obsolete. That night, Reinhardt didn't sleep. He sat in the barracks and waited for the knock on the door. It didn't come. By morning, he'd learned that the evening sortie had gone exactly as predicted. The schedule held, the enemy appeared at calculated moments, and 3 German aircraft had returned with no victories and 1 missing pilot. The system worked perfectly. The pilot, an older man named Schultz, who'd flown since 1939, had simply vanished into the calculation, subsumed into a footnote in someone's debrief report. The commander, when he finally met with Reinhardt, didn't rage. He seemed almost relieved. You understand what you're asking? Yes, sir. I'm asking to stop. To stop flying, you mean, or to stop the war? Reinhardt considered the question. I think they're the same thing now. The commander sat back in his chair and looked at the wall for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. My father was a pilot, First World War. He told me once that the day flying became mathematics was the day flying ceased to be worth doing. I thought he was being sentimental at the time. He looked at Reinhardt directly. How many sorties? 43. And kills? 2 confirmed, both in the first 6 months. So you know what it was like when it mattered. Yes, sir. The commander nodded slowly. I'll put in for your transfer. Ground duties. I suspect you won't be the last to request it. He paused. What will you do when the system finds you there too? Reinhardt understood the question. The system would eventually reach everywhere. There was no corner of the war that wouldn't eventually be occupied by calculation and schedule. I'll decide when it does. He left the commander's office and walked past the ready room where the afternoon pilots were being briefed. He could see them through the window, young men and old men, all wearing the same expression now. The look of people doing something they knew was pointless, waiting for the schedule to tell them when to stop. Reinhardt didn't watch the evening sortie take off. Instead, he stood at the southern edge of the field and looked across the Rhine toward France, toward the American lines. Somewhere there, in air-conditioned tents and intelligence rooms, officers were probably refining the schedule for tomorrow. Tightening it, making it tighter, until eventually even sitting in an office wouldn't be safe, because the system would be so complete that it would reach everywhere. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, Reinhardt had done something that no tactics or courage could achieve. He had stepped outside the calculation. Not by defeating the system, but by refusing to participate in it. It was a small victory, perhaps meaningless in the larger accounting of the war, but it was his own. For the first time in weeks, his time belonged to him, not to the schedule. He sat on a bench and watched the aircraft take off into the late afternoon. 43 sorties, 2 victories, and now finally silence.